as well. So I will just get started because we've got quite a lot to cover today. Good afternoon and welcome to our first In the Room series, Navigating Redundancies, Restructures, and the Human Side of Hard Decisions. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elise and I am in ELMO's marketing team. As we are meeting from the various locations, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders, past and present, as early innovators and acknowledge their significant contributions to science and technology throughout water and land and culture. So quick admin from us, you are in listen only mode, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you after today. The chat is open, ask your questions at any time and we'll take the time at the end to answer. If we run out of time or we don't get to your question, we will follow up with a response in the coming week. So today's topic is one that no one wants to have. It's restructures and redundancies are unfortunately a necessary part of an organisational remit and unfortunately a part of our HR leader's job at one point or another. So before we start, I wanted to share a quick poll with everyone, which is just to see like who's in the room with us. Have you ever led a restructure or redundancy program before? So we have yes, not yet, or I didn't lead, but I have participated. So we're just getting a little bit of a sense for who is in the room with us today. Okay, give it a little hot second, but we are seeing about half of you have led one, about a quarter not yet, and the rest of I didn't lead but participated. So I will just end that. So thank you. Oops, sorry. So today we're going to focus on three big areas: what a strong restructure framework looks like, how to prepare leaders and yourself for the hardest conversations, and what needs to happen after the announcement to stabilise the business and rebuild trust. So we've brought together two experienced practitioners to share what they've seen work and what they think you all need to know. So let me introduce them both. We have a special guest speaker, Susan Sadler, who is the CEO of Red Wagon Workplace Solutions and an ELMO partner. She's a trusted guide for organisations navigating complex and high-stake workplace challenges. And Susan has over 2 decades of experience in senior human resources and industrial relations. And Helen Tran is a strategic people and culture leader with over 18 years of experience in her field and is currently the head of P&C, People and Culture team here at ELMO. So thank you both for taking the time to join us today, and let's get into it. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. So when organisations start talking about restructures or redundancies, what do they often underestimate? Let's start with you, Susan.
Thanks, Elise. I think organisations often underestimate that the restructure itself can start as a commercial or operational decision. But I think that the way that it's handled really becomes a trust moment, and that's where HR step in and support their leaders. People don't only remember the outcome, but they remember whether the process felt clear, fair, honest, and human. So the business can often be solving a cost, a capability, a technology, or an operating model issue. But for the employees who are impacted, whether that is because they're being made redundant, whether one of their peers are but they're safe, whether it's the leader who's delivering the message, it's a really personal moment. And that's why I think that the underestimation comes with the process being dealt with as fully a process, and that we really need to focus on it being role-led, not person-led. So redundancy decisions being made about future work roles, not personalities, or a proxy performance review process. And I think sometimes organisations forget that, or it becomes easy to solve other problems through a redundancy process. And we need to keep front of mind, well, yes, it started with a business decision, and therefore it needs to be role-led, not person-led. That said, The operational load of managing a redundancy is real, it's high stakes. Often it's being led by in-house HR and leaders who are still trying to do their BAU. And that can affect a lot of the process and the frameworks and things that you need to go through. And that's why your planning becomes so important. And I think balance that with that the human piece is really real. It's not soft. It's not a nice to have. It's where the legal, the psychosocial, and the cultural and the reputational risk really intersect. So it's one of those moments where I think an organisation values really come under pressure, and whether they hold true and the honesty, integrity of those processes hold true in those pressure point moments, Elise.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, Helen, I was going to ask, but maybe to kind of keep going with this and just talk about, I guess, like knowing that one of the things you spoke about when we first started is that having that structured kind of
Mm.
3 to 4 week approach can make that difference between this work feeling more manageable or more chaotic. If you were advising a HR leader to build that runway today, what would need to happen before the first conversation takes place?
Yeah, sure, Elise. I mean, it's so critical. Susan just mentioned, the high pressure points, and it is at a high stakes. And like any high stakes program you're working on, it's all about what structure, what plan, what process you put in place leading up to the date or the week of execution. So your runway is so important. And, if I'm looking at a framework there's four elements of that framework, which to me are just, imperative and not to skip. And I think the very first one step is for everyone who's going to be involved in the restructure or involved in the transformation really understands the why. What is the business imperative to drive this change? That needs to be clear to the HR team, the executives, and so we can align to what the business goals and what they want to do through this and map that out. I think if there's any questions or misunderstanding about why we're doing this and what we're trying to achieve, you've got to go back to the drawing board because it's going to become clunky throughout in your comms and clunky as you're running that process. Um, I think also it's what type of restructure are we doing? Like, is this a problem we're solving, or are we trying to accelerate a goal? Because your approach, how you drive those conversations will sound very differently. I've worked across restructures which have been a pure cost out task, could be a digital transformation, or it could be like, no, we're actually doing great, but we need to redesign these teams to accelerate growth. So really understanding your why and how you're going to lead into those discussions is really key. And then it comes to the planning phase. Once you've scoped out the context and the why, you really want to get into that planning phase. And this is where the heavy lift is and the biggest effort takes, but it's the section you don't want to skip. And that's where I think leaders and HR, their roles are quite critical to work with leaders because they're often looking at the org design and the structure. Whereas we're there also to look at the people and the behavioral change management aspect of it. And I think, part of that process is sitting down with your executive, and this is part of the framework, is going, what does that future state look like? Where do you want to go? What are you trying to achieve? Um, do your research, what's best in market, align with that. And then that's when you start to look at your current state org chart and look at, okay, for you to achieve that, what kind of skills, capabilities, roles do you need to get to that point to achieve that outcome successfully? And this is where I find a lot of leaders get into the trap of making their decisions around the person and the personalities. And that's where HR leans in. I mean, they are the experts, they are the SMEs in their area, but I do find that HR needs to be aligned and walk through that process with them to ensure that there are no biases, to ensure that the redundancies, if there are any potential role impacts, are genuine. They're not based on this person hasn't been performing, so let's use this as an opportunity, which can be another common trap, and that they are based on the role and not the person in the role, because then you'll find it's not going to be successful once it's launched. So I think that is really key because that's how I overlook to make sure that it's a fair process. And then look, probably the third one is communicate. and be transparent. I can't say that enough. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Really, everyone needs to know what's going on, why it's going on. And I think that is where HR can also support leaders with leadership scripts, writing announcements, have your HR lens over it, but then also making sure that it's done in the tone of the leader and there's some authenticity to it and putting that human element in it. So communication is really clear. You also want to communicate to the staff that are non-impacted, and that could be as simple as writing out scripts during a consultation process where you may be keeping them up to date, thanking them for their patience. All communication elements through a whole communication pack is what I tend to give our leaders. And then fourthly is to map out, what does your renewal program look like? So what does that future world look like afterwards? How are we going to keep staff motivated? How are we how are we going to support them through the process when they're saying goodbye to their colleagues? I think all of this can be mapped out pre-hand to ensure that it's a smooth runway and that there's minimal business disruption.
That's great, Helen. Thank you. And I feel like I hope that's. I know there's a fair few on it with us today who have participated before. I'd be interested to hear. Feel free to, in the chat if that's something you've already followed. If you had a framework in place, maybe what hasn't worked. We'd love to sort of like hear, what has worked with you or what maybe hasn't worked, so we can like address it as we go. While everyone's doing that, what are the for you both? What are the non-negotiables you would want aligned across both HR, legal, payroll, IT, and the executive before a redundancy program goes live?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to take that one. I think when you're looking at HR, legal, payroll, legal is the first one that comes to mind. I think completing a full risk assessment is a non-negotiable. So you're looking at, if you're looking at your impacts, you want to look at your contracts, your industrial instruments. Are you covered by an award, covered by an EBA? What's important during that negotiation phase, because it can be quite different depending on the award coverage. You want to make sure that you're following the process that's laid out by the Fair Work, but also have you stress tested your execution plan? Have you gone through and mitigated scenarios? Look at any of your risks. Are there any adverse actions, grievance procedures you need to consider? Have you stress tested that it's a genuine redundancy? What about redeployment opportunities? So I think that's one area that's really important to cover off. And then also leadership, really working with your leaders and doing a bit of a dive and understanding who's done this before and who hasn't. What they can, what can be said and what to steer away from. And if they are presented with a question or something they don't know how to answer, to give them guidance on how to respond to that. A lot of leaders haven't done this before and it's their first time. I've had various situations in conversations in leader reactions, so able to bring in a couple of scenarios and play with particular people and how it can go down. And I think the third one is for yourself and payroll, IT, finance, is just keeping a really good documentation trail. So for HR, we want file notes of the conversations. We want a good audit trail to show that it was a fair process. But you also need to work really closely with your payroll and your finance, that you make sure the payments are made on time, IT, that the offboarding's done respectfully and accurately, and that all your calculations are in order when you're having those conversations.
Yeah, I agree with Helen, and I think the point that I'd like to make is that payroll and IT are often treated as back-end
Mm,
processes that we sort of think about at the end of a process, but they're not. They're quite key to the employee experience, and we need
yeah.
to, part of the runway that Helen talked about just before is planning all of that sequencing, and that's that planning and runway is not about bureaucracy and following steps exactly. It's actually about mitigating your risk and planning what the employee experience is, because remember that this is a process where they feel that they can often feel like they don't have control. So being really clear and giving them information and being transparent about the things you need to be transparent about, that is what makes them feel more comfortable in a really uncomfortable process. And it's the same for your leaders, no matter the level of experience. If you've got a clear communication framework, scripting, those sorts of tools to guide and aid them, then they are the things that lend it to be, in the worst of scenarios, a better experience and mitigate your risk as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally agree.
I think, Helen, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier around, I guess, like preferred, like, I guess you were talking about making a genuine redundancy and not letting it lead with personality or potentially, well, what would you call it? What did you say?
Personalities,
Job
yeah,
performance, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
So Susan, to add to that, how do you make a consultation genuine when the business already has a preferred direction or business or a leader? And how should HR leaders be watching for when it comes to what should HR leaders be watching for when it comes to redeployment?
Yeah. So there's two ideas there. One is, and to separate them out, one is the business has a preferred proposal, and the next is that they've got a predetermined outcome. Because so of course the business has a preferred direction. In reality, it will. It's doing a redundancy process for a reason, but it can't predetermine the outcome of, for example, a redeployment process, if there are legitimately roles that are being thrown up or other opportunities and consultation hasn't been gone through, because consultation needs to be genuine, and any ideas that the employee might have need to be genuinely considered. So you need to think about what can realistically change as a result of consultation. If the honest answer that you're getting back from your leaders is nothing, that's probably a little bit of a warning sign that you need to pressure test. The other things that can help make you come unstuck later, in a worst case scenario where you end up with the complaints or before a regulator or in some forum being questioned on whether it's a genuine redundancy. So consultation is more than inviting feedback. It's making sure that people understand the process, that they've got enough time to process that information, to respond, and then for you to also consider that feedback. So having a time frame of at 12 o'clock consultation ends and at 1 o'clock we're giving you determining the outcome, that's not enough time to consider if someone's actually genuinely. So again, this is what needs to be built into your process and your frameworks right at the start, to support that your consultation, your redeployment, and your redundancy as a whole is genuine. So it's sometimes HR need to slow it down when the business wants it to be like done really fast. You need to slow it down to make sure that people are understanding, that you can take a breath, that you've got time to show that you've considered. And redeployment needs to be approached with curiosity. So this isn't a matter of sending out a vacancy list and having someone apply and they are successful or they aren't successful. That's not a genuine redeployment. It might be what are other ways in which that person could be employed. We don't make assumptions about them accepting a lower, whether they would or wouldn't accept a lower rate of pay or another role. The test is, can they actually do the role? They might be senior, but they actually might be happy doing a mid-level sort of easy role, because that actually finally it gives them a chance to sort of take a breath and spend some more time with the kids or something. You don't know what is going on in other people's lives. So you have to be willing to put forward different ideas and consider different ideas. So genuine consultation, it's about being sensible. You don't have to create roles for people, but you do have to consider it. And I think curiosity is really important. And there was a recent case, the Helensborough Coal and Bartley case, that talked about, depending on the circumstances, reasonable redeployment may require considering work that's performed by your non-traditional sort of workforce. So your contractors, for example. So it's not just about your vacant permanent roles, it's about all of your roles. It's about, can we smoosh two part-time roles together? Can we do something else? Can a role be relocated from interstate? The case reference is Helen's Borough Cole versus Bartley. So the other things that you need to consider. And then the other issue Helen's already touched on is every award, every enterprise agreement, your contracts and your policies can affect the way that you do consultation. So make sure that you've gone back to your relevant industrial instruments. And even if you think you know what it says, it could have been a really old contract that had something really weird in there. Make sure you check your documents for each individual so you know what you're walking into.
Thanks, Susan. Sorry, I was just copying and pasting the court.
You beat me to it. Thank you.
Was
I can't
asking
multitask.
whether you need multiple people. That's really very succinct. So thank you. I have just missed my place in our script, but I wanted to, I guess, like talking about that kind of unavoidable risk and also understanding that many leaders within the business who may also not have taken place in a redundancy before, right? And they haven't, had to make someone in their team redundant. So Helen, how do you coach leaders to deliver that kind of news with clarity and empathy without sounding overly legalistic?
Yeah, look, I think, one of the approaches I do is actually develop leader enablement materials throughout, basically. So Q&A questions, so they're prepared for the conversation, run them through the process from beginning to end. And I think the main thing is not to avoid scripts. I mean, like we said, unavoidable risks is making sure that you've reviewed your industrial instruments, treating the process about removing people rather than just redesigning roles. I mean, that is the important part, but it's looking at that people element and that change in element, being prepared for how people will react. But I think when it comes to dealing it with empathy, you really got to, I see HR's role is putting, say, the meat to the bones on those essential points that need to be covered in a consultation that we're required to do, but then allowing the manager to add to that with their own tone and with their own empathy and with their own messaging. So we can really be there as a support. And as I said before, just coaching those leaders through the conversations and preparing them for the type of emotions that they could expect to see come through. I've had people angry, I've had people crying, I've had people wanting to walk out or stop. I've had people become very quiet and shy and intimidated in the meeting. And it's just like, how do you react in that? You go in and you can be scripted and prepared, but when you get in there, you just need to keep that calmness in there, hold space. Most important thing I usually say to my leaders is lead with the most important message first. So don't drag it out with this long, big waffle on why we're here. And, it's okay to say this is going to be a difficult conversation, but remember, this is about the person in front of you. So you want to come up early with, your role is at risk or your role could potentially be impacted, and explain to them that this is part of a consultation process. You want them to put forward considerations explaining why it's happened. And then for sure, let them know that, we understand that it's difficult. I think it's really important to pause, gauge the room, read the person's face. Yes, you can say I'm reading from a script, but go by the person's emotions, when to stop and when to continue again. Also, lean on your HR person in the room, or your HR person can step in if you can see that your leader's finding it difficult. One of the things that, I don't know, really important to me, that I always think about when I'm doing this is I quite often find the person is going to take it personally. And we know the line to say is, this is not personal. It's not about your performance, not about you as a person. It's about a role and the directions the person is going through. Sorry, the direction the company is going through. And I've been in situations where employees will say, "Oh, well, I'm just thinking about 3 months ago. Could have I done this better? Should have I put my name forward from this?" And I like to stop them. It might be not what they're thinking at the moment, but take away from them saying, "Look, it's really, really important to me that this does not impact your confidence." Because that's what happens to most people after redundancy. And when they start going in, what could have I done better? Should have done my role like this. It's like, this is not about your performance. This is not about you as a person. It's about the role. So highlighting to them that we don't want their confidence impacted by this. Hopefully they can walk away. And if they start to go into that kind of thought process themselves, catch themselves that it's not about anything that they have done. Yeah, so I think that shows empathy, and it also shows that it's a respectful conversation that you're having with the employee.
Yeah, I think it's really important to show empathy, and I think that we should be giving our leaders permission to be human in those conversations and recognize that it's a hard process to have without making it all about them. But it does have an impact, and but what they do need to, they can't be loose going into those conversations, because
No.
softening the message can then confuse the message. And I've certainly been brought in after the fact to try and put together a little bit of a mess of the message being softened to the point of the person not actually knowing what that meant, what at risk meant, what those words actually meant. So I personally always I agree with Helen. I prefer scripts, and you're walking into an emotionally tense situation for everyone. So having those tools to rely upon and support you, particularly if things do get heated or overwhelming or argumentative or something like that, you've got something to anchor back and rely on, and that might feel like it dehumanizes the process. But the clarity is actually the care is in the clarity, if you
Mm,
like. And Helen's saying people will tune off after the first couple of sentences. 100%. That's when their mind's racing about how am I going to get another job? Well, I've just bought a house.
mm.
What's my payout going to be? Oh, thank God I finally get a payout and I get away from here. Like all of those things, right? So your first few lines, don't waste time by showing this uncomfortable, "Oh, how was your weekend?" type conversation. It feels disingenuous even if you mean well. Get
Yeah.
in there, be clear, be human. And then if the conversation, as Helen says, does turn to, well, it's because I made a complaint, or because I'm not performing, it must be about me, then you can have in your script ways in which the leader can respond confidently to that without derailing the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think like we talked a little bit about even like a strong Q&A guide. I think we've mentioned it before, or in this pre-conversation about having a Q&A guide so you can respond to those sort of individual scenarios. And obviously, if you're having those conversations with the leaders first, you may already know how an individual is going to respond, so you can have those sessions first too and say, well, it's probably going to be this, so here's how we can prepare.
Yeah.
And that's a good point, Elise. I think it's really important to do before each conversation a pre-brief and then a debrief with the manager. So schedule that 5-10 minutes beforehand and after, because they've worked with this person, could be for a year, could be 2, 3, 4 years. And it's really good to gauge, what is this person like? How is this person going to deal with it? So that's extra prep you can do, and then debrief afterwards.
Yeah. And I think it's part of your planning and your tactics too. I mean, if an employee has say they've recently raised a complaint, and then it so happens that they're also being impacted by a redundancy, but the two don't have anything to do with each other, then don't necessarily put their frontline manager who they complained about in front of them to deliver the message. Like, don't assume that you've got to have the cookie cutter for everyone. You've got to
Mm,
be aiming for the smoothest process. So this is again, yeah, right at the start of your 3 week,
Planning.
4 week runway, plan it out, be sensible, do your risk assessment, because that will make your life much easier, or at least a little bit easier later on, I think.
And what are some of the, like, beyond, I guess, like that preparing for leadership, what are some practical details HR needs to choreograph carefully before they can, because they can make or break that experience?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the FAQs are handy more as a prep document, I think, for leaders. So this is the path that you're wanting to stick on in terms of answering questions. These are the things that you don't want to. But here's your FAQ you can refer to afterwards, that as they start to digest and ask questions of you, that will be a bit of a guide for you. As soon as they start to, I've found that when managers start to ad lib, that's when they say the stuff that you're just like, oh no, don't, please don't, stop. Or we butt in, don't we, Helen? And we say, yeah,
Yes,
okay, moving. We're not here to discuss that. Let's.
yes,
So again, like, saying to them, I've got this. Have a look at it. So then you can answer some questions. If you don't know, I'll jump in. But this is really the message that you're getting through. The other stuff is actually help your payroll people. So often, somewhere in that consultation period, they will start getting calls, particularly if you're doing a larger scale redundancy, they'll start getting phone calls from people saying, so what's my payout going to be? Well, what's going to be if I do this? Well, what about, how does that impact the annual leave that I've applied for? Help them by having some FAQs and some guidance on what they can or can't say, or make sure that you've actually got that escalation or question, path for questioning available, and that you inform the employees of that.
yeah,
So, you don't, also, the more people that are giving messages, the more likely those messages are to start to conflict. So I always like to have a letter to either give them at the meeting or after the meeting. Ultimately, your letter is pretty much your script. If you, for some reason, lost your piece of paper with your script on it, your letter is generally a good guide for that. But I won't give it to the person at the start of the meeting, because as soon as they undo it, it's a bit like when you do allegation letters. As soon as they unfold it, they'll stop listening to you and they'll start reading and looking for the details. So you can say to them, I'll give all of this to you in writing at the end. Then if they tune out or the meeting goes pear-shaped and you've got to end it early or whatever, then you're giving them and confirming everything that you've said in writing. So it's, in a way, it's a tool because it supports you. It is an important part of the process. Also, know what those escalation paths are. So again, this is a part of your strategy and your tactics of who is going to be delivering the message in the meeting, and at what points does HR step in if they need to, or and how do you actually manage that dynamic in the meeting? That's supporting your leader. It's supporting the experience for the individual. And these are all the practical things that can help make it work. The trickier ones are probably when you're not doing a redundancy face to face, when you're doing it online. I don't know if anyone in our audience has done that or is doing that. I've certainly done a few in my time, Helen. But with that, the only other practical tip that I would say is ask who else is in the room, or whether, get an understanding of whether they've got a child who might be sitting just, down on the floor out of sight, who might get really distressed if the parent gets up stressed when they receive a message. So think about some of those sorts of practical logistical things as well when you are planning and when you start the meeting, so you see what those things look like.
yeah. And look, I think to add to that, another addition to that for the employee's experience is, ensure that you have all your most updated and relevant EAP materials ready. It mentioned that in the meeting that, look, we understand this is difficult. EAP will be provided to you and immediate family members. Definitely that's what we offer. But you can also, there's times I've been in meetings meetings where the person's so upset that we've gone that one above and saying, if you do want to have an EAP session, let me know and I can book it for you. Otherwise, you can provide them the number and you send out the materials after the meeting. So these are just other care points you can put in place. Some companies may also offer outplacement, but also it's really important to reiterate that it is a private and confidential meeting because you do not want them walking out and getting support from other team members or start asking questions of their leaders outside of the meeting. So I think if you've got that toolbox to say, I understand that you might need to speak to somebody. Yes, it's confidential, but of course speak to your family and friends because some people don't know. They get a bit shocked or worried if it's their first time or if this is confidential, who am I allowed to speak to? And then say, but we do have resources for you. Reach out to your HR business partner or your HR contact, or here is an EAP number. And of course, speak to your family and friends. So letting them know that they do have those support mechanisms around them.
Yeah, I think, and not every organisation has EAP, but
Mm,
there are lots of other support agencies, and if you don't have EAP, or even if you do, you can lean into that as well. And I tend to say, you support people and other support services. That could be your GP, it could be Beyond Blue,
mm,
those sorts of things, and share either those links or numbers in letters. I saw that in the chat that someone's mentioned about bringing support people, and I think it certainly can be good to offer to someone to bring a support people. Your obligation is not to offer unless you've got that written into your policies or enterprise agreement. Your obligation is not to refuse it, and I'm always in a really of two minds about how this works for a redundancy situation, because best practice says we give notice of the meeting, we tell people that they can bring a support person, but we don't tell them what the meeting's about. We say we're scheduling a meeting to talk about your role with the organisation, and everyone knows what it means, but it's and you've got 24 hours to wait. And I think those processes are really damaging to people. The reality is, when you are informing someone that they might be impacted by redundancy, unless you're making, even frankly, if you're making them redundant on the spot without consultation, you're not asking them to respond to anything. So the reality is they probably don't need a support person. It's not a disciplinary process. If they ask for one, you have to say yes. But you don't actually, at that first meeting, necessarily need to offer one. And I feel like where you're causing them stress for 24 hours of notification beforehand to allow them time to find a support person, that's probably not necessary. So have a think about some of those things with your planning, how the organisation likes to do those sorts of things. But don't damage people by process. And where that comes into play as well is if someone says, look, I know that you're going to make my role redundant, and I'm okay with that, but there's no point in us going through this. Like, let's just have the meeting and get it done. It might suit you to actually do that and say yes, or it might be actually, look, we've got a process. I can't make any changes. Respect what you're saying, but I'm sorry, we've just got to leave the meeting as booked. So, have a think about what's reasonable and what you can reasonably adjust to make the process a better experience and fair for people.
Yeah, that's that really covers quite a lot of the points we wanted to cover today. And I have seen a few questions come through. I'm going to save them to the end, just conscious of time. And one of the key things we wanted to address is talking about that after the redundancy process, especially if it's a big restructure and there's a lot of people impacted. That can be, I'm sure for everyone attending, understand like heavy trust, it needs to be rebuilt. So like maybe Susan, to start off with, what should HR leaders focus on in the days and weeks that follow a big announcement like this?
Yeah, well, hopefully in your planning process, you've got a bit of a comms message. So the one line that you're carrying through around the reason why this is occurring. So you've got consistency with what's being told to everyone, whether they are being made redundant, redeployed, or not impacted. And not impacted sounds a bit heartless because everyone's impacted in some way. But I think remember that the process doesn't end after the letters are issued, particularly for the people maybe they're being asked to work out their notice, which I certainly, when I was made redundant once and I was asked to work out my notice, and I've never worked so hard in those 4 weeks to do a job that apparently wasn't required anymore. But each to their own. But for the people who are left, like, that survivor's guilt is real, and resentment and rumours. We all know that particularly in silence. That's where where rumors will grow, and people will start to bitch, and the negativity can really start to pick up a bit of a groundswell. So remember that the rest of the workforce is watching. How people were treated during that process becomes the new baseline of trust for the people who remain in the organisation, and it will be the baseline for when they think, wow, if this happens to me in the future, that's how I'm going to be trusted. And whether they might then start to feel uneasy, start to look for another job, or, hey, look, if this does happen, I feel really uncomfortable, but I feel safe that I'll be treated with dignity and respect. So there will often be a loss of confidence in leadership. There'll be practical concerns around workloads. That's really common. You've just got to keep the cadence of communication going and explain what's changed, what's not changed, what happens next, and when they'll hear more if there's more to hear. So keep that going, follow through visibly, lead from the front, keep on reviewing, take feedback, listen to what people have to say. That doesn't mean that you're arguing or dissecting the decisions, or that you're interrogating it further and that you're going to overturn it. You need to really listen, but not be over the top with it. It's a fine balance to make it seem genuine. And know that now, in a world where we talk about psychosocial risk all the time, that risk continues and it is real. So role clarity is now really important. Well, if you're dispersing some of that work amongst other employees, making sure that they understand what that is and that is documented, that workload doesn't become too much for some people, that job security and conflict don't explode because of those uncertainties. So build check-ins, have the frontline leaders, have the people leaders have check-ins at all levels to make sure everyone's okay, that the people leader is having a check-in with their leader because they're covering, they're holding a lot themselves, making sure that they're okay. HR can look at engagement signals like your employee absenteeism, any rising conflict, increases in disputes, and listen to your leaders and your managers and take on board their feedback. But I think, communication, ongoing support, particularly for your managers, and keep on listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Helen?
Yeah, no, look, I think Susan covered that really well. I think that is, again, where we find sometimes the planning can fall over, is you get to the point and it's like that you've reached that big hurdle of having those conversations, gone through the consultation period. And leaders, just remember, leaders are exhausted by this stage. It is quite natural that it's kind of, they've carried that heavy load, they've carried that conversation they're going to have, and they are exhausted. So HR support is still very critical to keep that going. We can get exhausted at the end of the future plan being announced, but I think, look, it really is a fine line here between giving time for the remaining staff to be able to process it and go through their own emotions, also offer them EAP if they need it. It's a fine line of letting that dust settle, but then going, now we're going to look forward. What does the future plan look like? And you just got to gauge when that timing is right. Obviously, you're going to have commercial decisions made, business decisions, and business has to go on, but you can do that delicately. And that is, again, right down to that pre-planning and your communication. Like communication is so key in keeping them across it, no matter how hard the conversations are, that you're letting them know that colleagues left, they're going to appreciate and respect that in the long run. And the way you show up as a leader and show accountability for the decision. Don't blame the decision on HR. Don't blame the decision on the business. This is my decision, or, our decision as leaders.
It's no
And
one's fault. There's
it,
always a number of factors that
that's
come into
right.
it. So, yeah.
That's right. But together, we're also going to build the way it looks moving forward. And I think checking in 1 or 2 weeks later with the group and the team again, and then also looking at, getting their input on how we're going to work moving forward. What's going to change? What do the new teams look like? How should our meeting cadences look? What input do you want to have into this new world? Can really make them feel that they've got a voice in how they're going to work moving forward. And then also speaking to that security element. So, if it is a case that this is the end and there will be no more restructuring, then say it, show that security, start planning, setting their OKRs for the new world. And that just gives people a sense of security.
But don't make false promises. So if there is a
You'd never say
possibility,
never.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
because
If there's
that's
a
never,
possibility of
yeah,
another restructure, if business downturn
yeah,
continues, or so you need to be realistic and honest and say, look, we're hopeful that this is the last one. There's certainly nothing else planned, but if we lose another major client, then we'll have to, we're constantly looking at ways to do blah blah blah, or
yeah,
whatever it is. But communication is really the spine of this process, I think, and everything else hangs off of it, from the way that you communicate to and share information with your managers, to the impacted employees, to those that remain in the organisation. And I think it's the oft forgotten aspect of this process that we say, okay, we've got our letters, we've got our timing, we know what we're doing. Well, actually, what's your communication thread? What's your golden line that goes through everything that you're talking about?
yeah.
Yeah, thanks both. I'm going to summarize or finalize, I guess, this discussion. Have a couple of like 5 minutes or so for questions, because there's a few that have come through. If you don't mind answering, I'm going backwards, but Susan, you were talking a little bit before about the letter, sending out the email and so forth, and someone's asked or answer, asked, the recent safe work and legal guidance around psychosocial safety is to provide 24 hours notice of the meeting and offer a support person. This seems a little bit different to what has been explained in this webinar. Can you please confirm?
Well, guidance isn't an obligation, so it's your choice. If you feel that it's certainly defensible to take that stance. I feel, and in some situations that can be, that can work. It depends on your read of how many people are impacted, the culture, whether you've got union engagement. You need to assess the risk and how the messaging is going to land in your particular unique situation, and then make the decisions around timing. So there are many instances where I do give 24 hours or 12 hours notice, and there are instances where we'll give 4 hours. So the answer to that is it depends. But that is guidance, not a legislative, you must provide that level of notice.
Great, thanks, Susan. We've got two sort of similar questions, sort of similar. It's around like talking to the both coaching managers and also speaking to the impacted person. The question is, how do you coach managers to respond to a question if the decision, like the question is the decision already made? And you allow, say, a week for a consultation for consideration and feedback, but often the employer naturally feels that that decision has been made. Um, in in the same kind of vein, I guess another person had the question around explain to an individual why they're impacted versus another team member. I guess there's kind of like a bit of synergies there if you've got two same roles basically, and only one of them's been impacted. Helen, do you want to have?
Yeah, look, I think the purpose on the consultation is to make it clear that a final decision hasn't been made. Even if that's been the instruction from the business, like you do not know what an employee can come back with as a consideration, a suggestion, or a recommendation, and they are entitled to put that forward. And I have been in situations myself in a redundancy consultation period where what the person has put forward has been quite a really good suggestion that the business has not thought about or knew something more particular about the role and come up with a viable solution to mitigate the risk and the impact on the role. And it's worked out quite successfully, and the redundancy has been off the plate. So it's really important that that is reiterated at the first meeting, that the final decision hasn't been made, because it shouldn't be. In terms of how do you explain to an individual when they ask why they're impacted in the team versus another member? So that's a really interesting question, because depending on what that context is, if I have an example, if we take an example, is it a situation where you may have four payroll managers all at the same level, all do the same role? Are we reducing down from four roles to two roles? Then the proper process would be to do an interview, and you could do a fill and spill, put them through an interview process, or to do a skills assessment against the role. So on their capabilities, their experience, and do a scoring that way to make sure that a fair process has been run. But when you're going through that with the employee and the impacted employee, if you do run that more as a fair process through an interview process, that question shouldn't need to be asked, because they've gone through applying for the role against their colleagues who perform the same job. Susan, do you have anything to add on tactics you've used?
Yeah. I normally use a matrix process or a matrix and an interview.
Yeah,
I wouldn't rely solely on the interview. And then you can rely upon a number of factors have been considered. We're not going to share the detail with that of that with you.
yeah,
Then if you have factored in the personality, they've got an argumentative personality and it just doesn't gel, or some other thing that is the reality, right? Then you can have that, but you don't have to. You absolutely would never share that information, but you could have that something around team fit in a matrix, or collegiality or something. Um,
behavior. Yeah,
I think, yeah, behavior. Yeah, that's a nice word.
behavior.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah.
I've only had one coffee this morning. Not enough for HR people. I think the other thing is when they start saying, well, what about so and so? Why is it me? Why isn't it so and so? The simple answer is, look, we're not here to discuss what is happening to anyone else. We're here to discuss the impact on you. We understand that that's difficult, but because of confidentiality, we're not going to share that information about the details of the process, or how other people have been impacted. And you just shut that down, and don't engage in those conversations. And that's part of the prepping that you need to do for yourself as HR, and part of the encouragement of your leaders is to say, you do not have to engage in these debates. You can shut it down by saying, look, we're just simply not going to share that information. I understand that that's difficult, and I know that that is not the answer that you wanted, but we can't because of confidentiality, or we can't because of commercial restrictions, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
It
wonderful.
is really important, as Susan was saying, you're shutting it down, but it's really important you have done your process beforehand and kept your audit record of how you've made that selection or come to that conversation. Should that person, take issue with it, or try to raise a claim, an unfair dismissal claim.
Yeah. Um, I'm trying to see if I can I'm kind of caveating themes, but I'm not, sorry. So I'm going to go to a different question. Someone's asked, we're closing due to funding not being available after years of state government contract. Should organisations put in place if financial EAPs post closure? EAPs post closure. should orgs put in place if financial EAPs post-closure? Does that make sense to you?
I Look, the reality with the EAP is that not all organisations can afford it, and I don't know if anyone in the audience, if they're from South Australia or saw the Holden closure of 10 odd years ago, and that shows my age a little bit, I think. But they had this what was considered gold star closure process where they had Centrelink. I went out and had a look. They literally had Centrelink kiosks on site. They had EAP on site. It was the most amazing setup. The reality is, I don't know any other organisation that could truly ever do anything like that, because it's unrealistic and cost prohibitive for most, and they had a lot of government funding. So if you've got either self-funding, other sources of funding, government funding that you can have, ongoing EAP, that you can do those sorts of things, awesome. That is great, because you're supporting people, and that is what we should do in a really difficult time of their life, have those support mechanisms available. If you can't, do the best with what you've got. There are free resources. Normally, after any sort of termination, if you do have EAP, you would continue to offer that for a period of time, say a week or 2 weeks or something, depending on your policy, after the employee has ended employment. That would be no different under a restructure and redundancy situation. But, you know, there's no obligation to have career counselling or what's the mental blank, Helen? What's the word when we outplacement? There we go.
services.
You don't have to do those things, and
Yeah.
if you can, amazing. If you can't, because often it's a cost down measure, then do
Yeah.
what you can.
Yeah, those things are really a business decision, commercial decision. It's not mandatory or obligatory, but as Susan said, there are a lot of free services out there that can use, like Beyond Blue, and you can put that in. You can put that in your second letter, in the termination letter. I've definitely worked for organisations before. We say, some resources that you can point them to, and website links and numbers if you want to take that extra step.
Yeah, 100%.
Centrelink, they can get in contact with Centrelink for job seekers allowance and things like that. You can make it a bit easy by having it all printed on a page for them, point it to them, but you're not giving advice. You've got to be really clear that you're not personally advising them, but here are some suggested resources that may, yeah.
And particularly in terms of tax treatment and financial advice and those sorts of things, make sure that you're clear that you're not giving advice on that. The one thing that you do need to be conscious of, particularly if people are working out notice periods, is that often in awards there is the allowance to give time off to go to job interviews or look for jobs. So again, you've checked your industrial instruments because you've done your prep really well. So you would know who and where that applies to.
That might be actually the kind of final question we have time for. There's a couple of people who asked it, and it's around unions. They've asked if we can please discuss engaging with the union in this process. A few people need to deal with a union and they haven't spoken to them before. So Susan, maybe in particular?
Yeah, I think again, there's a bit of an it depends. It can depend on what your relationship with the union is. Of course, there's no such thing as a off the record conversation with them, so don't get fooled by that. But if you're doing large scale, particularly larger scale, or a number of people are being impacted by redundancy, then that can trigger your consultation clauses in particularly enterprise agreements that will require you to notify the union. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to give them 2 weeks heads up before you notify the workforce, and frankly, I wouldn't necessarily. But that is something that needs to be factored into those processes, and will also come in your risk strategy to understand, well, do we anticipate that we're going to get more pushback, that there's going to be more argument, that our consultation is going to change because we've got a highly active union, or are we sending them a letter to notify more as a courtesy on the same day as we're sending out meeting notifications to employees. I don't think that you need to. I wouldn't get overly hung up on it. It's just another notification point, Helen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this really goes back to why you need those couple of weeks planning before to review your industrial instruments. If someone wants to bring a union representative along with them to the consult, what they can and what they can't do. So I agree. And usually notification is based on numbers, the amount and the size of the organization. So understanding where your organization sits with that, what awards you're covered by. But yeah, I think that's really key, really important to do up front. But I agree, it's just really another notification. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks you. Thanks both. It's been really, I hope everyone's found it as insightful as I certainly have. I am going to just to share this short poll with you all because we do love to hear how how we've gone today and how everyone's gone. And also if there's anything you'd like to hear in the future, and topics you'd like us to explore, because we're finding a lot of people coming to these and we really want to help,